I'm Suzanne. I am a writer, an author, and a teacher.
And I am Mychal. I am a sommelier, a tarot reader, and a former ballerina. And this episode is M for Moonology.
I'm so excited about this one.
I know you are. You even got your Moonology shirt on.
It's true. I do.
We always want to start off by saying that this is intended to be a safe space where we are just sharing our own personal experiences and knowledge on these topics, and that at the very least you're entertained by what it is that we're sharing.
So what are we drinking for Moonology?
So the label is a little bit more on the nose. If I say the name, it's not necessarily going to ring true. It is a New Zealand Pinot Noir called Burn Cottage. It is absolutely delicious. So the sub name to this is Moonlight Race. I got that wrong. Moonlight Race. Burn Cottage Moonlight Race. Yes, this is it. It's from Central Otago. This is in New Zealand, like I said. This is also a biodynamically made wine, which is also
very much on point for being Moonology.
Exactly.
So Moonology has basically been around since people started. So in terms of a definition, it is the practice pretty much of using the moon to guide some of your decisions. And one of those being what kind of grapes to plant at what time.
Yes, this is definitely a part of biodynamic farming. Not to make this about the whole thing about wine at all, but I know I kind of alluded to this in the past when we have for the astrology episode about biodynamic wine. So biodynamic wine, it's really alluding to the practices of farming. It is a style of organic farming. It is one of the highest levels and hardest certifications to reach of organic farming. And there really is everything that you do is governed by the phases of the moon. It also goes a lot further than that. Anybody who is into this will tell you that. I mean, there's a whole lot of you bury a cow horn with manure and soil, and you plant crystals into the ground, and you dance around, and all this kind of thing. It goes very far.
Super woo.
It's very super woo. I'd have to say biodynamic farming is definitely a kind of farming that, depending on the vineyard managers that you speak to, that they would definitely, it's more on the woo-woo side for sure.
I think if you're dancing around at dark under the moon, it's almost by Western definition woo. Maybe not in the rest of the world, but
yeah, especially also the planting of crystals in the ground. And I mean, there is a lot more science behind this, as far as you have to plant a lot of other kinds of plants in there. You have to have a certain amount of grazing animals like sheep on your land in order to naturally kind of take care. It's more like creating its own biosystem, essentially, is what you're doing.
Which is also, Moonology, which has been practiced, and the reason why they have all those practices is because they picked them up from agrarian practices from thousands of years before that were successful.
Yes.
And I think that's maybe the underscore of all things Moonology is people do it because it works.
Yes. I would have to say that there's debate about whether or not, I think the same thing is true, whether or not astrology or all these things can be proved of whether or not. But I have to say that in farming, more than anything, it is an actual example of how it works. It's a real physical, tangible thing that you can measure, that there is a measurable difference. So, Suzanne, I know that we kind of discussed a little bit how this is woo. When we were debating, should we give an actual definition of what this is?
Sure.
How would you define Moonology?
I think the definition is people who are using moon cycles and rhythms as their ology, as their science.
Okay. So it seems like, I'm sure you're probably asking the question out there, listeners, about how Moonology is different than astrology, or isn't it kind of the same? Isn't it, all one thing? Suzanne, what would your answer be to somebody asking that question?
I would say Moonology is sort of an underscoring of astrology. So astrology are planets and transits and things like that that encompass your whole life, but the moon really affects you if you are a person who is affected by the moon in segments in 2.5 days. Like that is how fast. So the moon travels through the entire zodiac in 28 days. And in that 28 days, if you are susceptible to the moon cycles, then you will feel almost an accelerated experience of going through a year emotionally, but just in smaller pieces. And so I would say that's the big difference that I can see. And also, to study the moon, to apply the moon to your life, you need to know one thing, as opposed to, I feel like the more I get into astrology especially, it's a massive amount of information, and then it's all of the relationships, and it's all of the connections, and it's all of the aspects, and you just keep going down and down and down the hole. Whereas with the moon, you can be kind of like, okay, on days that are Capricorn, I feel like doing math.
So you just kind of reminded me about a very personal thing that I am going to share. But before I share this, I wanted to ask you, how do you use this in your day-to-day? Like, is this something that this is a leading question because I know this is the case. How do you use this in your day-to-day, Suzanne?
So I actually figured out years ago that I was really, really affected by the moon. I think probably growing up, I was considered a really moody child, and I certainly felt moods. I did not link them to the changing moon cycle of every 2.5 days until very recently. And it was
probably because you weren't tracking it.
I wasn't, and not for that. And
yeah.
I was tracking it not in terms of the zodiac, but in terms of, full and balsamic and new and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, definitely feel that. I mean, I think there were like 3 or 4 years where I didn't sleep through an entire full moon. But for the benefit is understanding what zodiac sign, and so getting an idea of how to use my personal energy best. So the days that I, need to just lock myself in a room and write, and that's all I want to do, versus the days that I, want to spend in meditation and, thoughtfulness, or the days that I just need to be out, moving, having adventures.
Pretty much when the tide is out versus in.
I mean, that is definitely the moon. It obviously affects all water on Earth, but I think there are some of us who the water in our bodies is more affected. We feel the, neutrino stream coming through the planets much more strongly. And the moon helps kind of balance what sometimes feels like, as I talked in balance, that I can't figure out how to do this, and I am beginning to figure out how to do this, which is just link it to the moon, and then I can have an idea of what I can plan for and how I can trust myself better.
Right.
So what is your practice?
So mine is kind of completely different, but I'm going to link this to wine. Now for something completely different. No, mine is wine related, and it's so there is. It's debated, but I can tell you as a regular taster.
Is this going to be the stem fruit leaf thing?
Yes.
This is so fascinating.
Susanna's reading my mind right now. Very woo-woo.
She shared the app with me a couple of years ago.
So there is an app that you can get if you want to try this out yourself, but you probably, in order to really pick up all the nuances, or maybe not, I don't know, give it a shot, that there is a biodynamic wine app that you can get that'll tell you, just like Suzanne is saying, every 2.5 days that the moon changes signs, but it also will change your experience in tasting a wine. So not just with how people plant it and do all that. I've really experienced this, and personally in a first person experience. because so much of my job in the past has been tasting wine regularly and tasting the same things over and over and over again. So, like, I really have a base of what something really tastes like. And so I would taste something one day or even taste a bunch of different wines that I hadn't tasted before, but I'll notice like a link in the day. I was like, wow, everything is really floral today, or everything is really fruity today, or I'll taste everything just doesn't taste right or tastes like lackluster or something like that. And so I would ask other people I was working with, I'm like, you have the app, right? And they're like, and I would guess. I always would treat it as a game. I was like, is today a fruit day? Or because that's how it's labeled. So you have leaf days, root days. Those are the 2 days that things don't taste good, by the way. And then you have flower days and fruit days. Did I say fruit already?
So in a way, this is a great way to decide when you want to drink a glass of wine and get the maximum out of it.
No, absolutely. So if you've invested a lot in a bottle of wine, you want it to taste really good, I would highly recommend, if you were to use this app, to open it up and drink it on a flower or a fruit day. And believe me, especially if you have a very sensitive palate, you can absolutely pick this up. It really does change your experience with the wine, so much so that, I mean, it wasn't just me who could pick up these nuances. Also, the other people that I was working with would notice the same thing. And sometimes we would just ask, like, everything tastes kind of not great today. Like, is today a leaf day or something? And yeah, sure enough, it would be.
So wine stores should just be closed on leaf days?
Not the stores. Like, you can buy wine.
But for the tasting of it, kind of like...
Well, and that's where...
Don't have dinner parties on leaf days?
Well, yeah, maybe. Or if you want it to be that way, I'd have to say, as a professional, it's my job to really suffer through these things for you guys. You're welcome. Again. But yes, it's being able to keep that in mind. That is an aspect of my job that when I'm tasting things, I'm like, okay, so I need to factor that into it, that perhaps this may not be the experience, but also that on certain days this will be some people's experience, because I cannot control when somebody's going to open up and drink their bottle of wine.
True. But this is another example of how Moonology actually works in the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. It has an underlying effect in a lot of different ways that you don't realize. I mean, I think a lot of people who work in the police department and in hospitals, the fire department.
As a former reporter, I can tell you, yes, it was a lot more accidents, assaults, all that kind of thing happening on full moons, which isn't the zodiac necessarily, but it is definite
cycle.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And showing how, whether you believe it or not, whether you recognize it or not, you are still being affected by these things.
Yeah, it doesn't require your belief in order for it to, have its effect on you at all.
Kind of like rain. It doesn't need you to believe in it. It's still going to fall.
It's still going to fall, and it's still going to be there. Well, I think there's a lot of other things that over time have kind of lost, what's the word? There's a word for...
Practice legitimacy?
No, not legitimacy.
I mean, a lot of Moonology comes down to us as quote-unquote old wives' tales.
Yes, that's what I'm referring to. So there's a lot of things that I just recently have heard myself about what is recommended and what is not recommended for you to do on a full moon versus a new moon. And I know that Suzanne said that she is familiar and has heard of it previously from a younger age than I was. And I've just recently, getting into astrology, have become privy to this.
Well, I remember my mother saying, what time that you wanted to get your hair cut and things like that, you find in an almanac. Mm-hmm. That, again, we sort of are maybe a little bit dismissive of the Farmer's Almanac, but it is chock full of that kind of information that is gathered from 1,000 years of research, essentially.
Yeah, it's kind of proven to be fairly accurate or legitimate. One being, obviously for farmers, when to plant certain plants, not just the season, but the cycle of the moon. Mm-hmm. I think, new moons is good to plant. I know one of them is majority of other fruits and vegetables, it's okay, but then root vegetables, it's the opposite option.
Well, so there's root vegetables, hollow vegetables, and leafy vegetables, and they all have different times to be planted.
Yes. But Suzanne, for all of you who are interested in either hair growth or not hair growth, we will tell you. It is, if you want to have long, luxurious hair that grows quickly and full and thick, get a haircut on a full moon. If you are...
In a specific sign.
Well, it's...
Preferably Leo.
Yeah, Leos are known for having a great mane. So if you want to have like a really good hair day, for sure, absolutely get your hair cut on a Leo full moon. That's like the best time ever. But obviously, you're going to have to get your hair cut more often than once a year. But beyond that, if you are doing hair removal, so like if you shave or you wax or anything like that, it's better to do that on a new moon as being... Because the whole point of getting your hair cut on a full moon is that it'll grow back thick and full. If you're doing any kind of hair removal, obviously you don't want it to grow back thick and full. So you want the opposite thing to happen. So it makes it easier to remove, but also that it'll be less likely to grow back as quickly.
And here's a health tip that you're not going to find on probably any other Western radio program, which is if you think you have parasites, you will know because they will be awake during the full moon, the most aggravated. And so that used to be the time when people would take their, green walnut or black walnut tinctures to kill the cycles. And again, these are things that people know in other countries and in other cultures, and we so far removed from our agrarian roots, pun there, have forgotten, and in some cases to our detriment.
Yes. What was another one that I recently heard too? Oh, you have a tendency to use talking about things being aggravated. So if you have kidney stones, they'll typically be more painful around the full moon. Also, that if around a full moon, you have a tendency to bleed more.
Yeah.
So it's not recommended. Like if you have to have dental work done, maybe don't plan it around a full moon. It'll just make things more difficult.
And these are things that you can find out if you just go to any of the astrology sites and look up their specific lunation cycle, and it will have a list of all the things to not do on this kind of moon or that kind of moon or this season. So there are many ways that you can help yourself out. There are also calendars that you can buy. I know that I specifically keep track. As I said, I have discovered it sort of is a major key to my being able to accomplish things, but in a sort of gracious flow state as opposed to cramming and pushing myself to the limit, which is how I spent most of my life. And the other thing is moodiness. If you feel, well, let me rephrase that. I, like I said, was considered moody, but once I aligned with the moon zodiac and the cycles and stop trying to make myself somebody I wasn't on that day with the understanding I'm going to be there in a couple of days, it was just incredibly freeing. So if you feel like you don't have as much control as you would like over your emotions, that might be something to look into.
Yeah, for sure. I think that all of these things, just like astrology in general, we're not saying, obviously life happens. There's sometimes going to be things that cannot be avoided, and, life is what it is. It's just that if you do have the ability to kind of schedule around, you might as well just give yourself a helping hand. You would rather have the wind at your back than working against you.
And also, if you are aware of these things happening, then when something does explode or does shift, you have a little bit more capacity to adjust with it because you realize it's, not going to last forever.
It was not a surprise.
And that somehow this is going to be for your benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Suzanne. So for our next episode, which is going to be N, what are we going to do?
Well, we were going to do numerology, but having done Moonology, it's a very similar ology.
Very true. And astrology. We've done a lot of ologies.
I have no problem with lots of ologies, but similar ologies.
That's true.
So what about in being a surprise?
It's going to be a surprise.
Now it's going to be a surprise.
So stay tuned for our surprise episode of N on All the Woo, A to Z.